Steve Jobs was never actually fired from Apple. The story Hollywood turned into 3 separate movies is wrong in almost every detail. The real story starts with a product that was quietly destroying the company from the inside, and a boardroom coup that Jobs himself launched first and lost. Stay with this, because what he did in the 4 months after losing that vote is the part nobody talks about. Everyone remembers the 1984 Super Bowl ad. Ridley Scott directing, a sledgehammer smashing Big Brother. It felt like a revolution. Here's what the commercials didn't show. By the holiday season of 1984, the Macintosh was selling roughly 20,000 units a month against a projected 75,000. That's less than 30% of target. Apple posted its first ever quarterly loss and laid off 1,200 workers. The revolution had stalled before it started, and one man inside Apple knew exactly who to blame. Why was the Mac failing? The price was $2,495 in 1984, steep enough to scare off families and impossible to justify for business. It shipped with only 128 kilobytes of memory, no hard drive, and almost zero third-party business software. Workers couldn't run spreadsheets on it. Companies wouldn't buy it. The machine Jobs called the most important product in history was selling at 27% of target. Meanwhile, one older, unglamorous product was quietly keeping Apple alive, and Jobs wanted to kill it. The Apple II. It was older, clunkier, and Jobs openly despised it. But in early 1985, the Apple II was generating 85% of Apple's total revenue. 85%. The entire company was running on a machine Jobs considered beneath him. His plan was to cannibalize that division, redirect its resources, starve it of investment, and force the market to adopt the Mac. The board saw exactly where that road ended, so they brought in someone Jobs himself had recruited to manage him, and that decision was about to blow up spectacularly. In 1983, Jobs had personally recruited John Sculley away from Pepsi with one of the most famous lines in business history. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world? Sculley said yes. He became Apple's CEO. Jobs assumed he'd hired an ally, a marketing mind who would execute Jobs' vision and stay out of the way. For about a year, that's roughly how it worked. But by spring of 1985, Sculley had seen enough quarterly numbers to know something had to give. Jobs moved first. In May of 1985, while Sculley was scheduled to travel to China, Jobs began privately lobbying board members to remove Sculley and hand Jobs full operational control of the company. He called it a management intervention. The board called it a coup. When Sculley found out, he canceled the China trip, confronted Jobs directly, and forced an immediate vote. On May 24, 1985, every board member sided with Sculley. Jobs lost unanimously. But what Jobs proposed immediately after losing the vote is almost too audacious to believe. With a straight face, Jobs walked up to Sculley and proposed a deal. The two men would simply swap roles. Jobs would become president and CEO of Apple. Sculley would step back to chairman of the board. Sculley rejected it on the spot and signed the paperwork stripping Jobs of all operational authority. On May 31st, Jobs was removed as vice president and general manager of the Macintosh division. He kept his title as chairman, kept his office on the Cupertino campus, kept his salary. But he had no employees, no reports, and no power. He was, in the words of people who were there, functionally invisible. That lasted exactly 4 months. Here's a detail that tells you everything about how Jobs was perceived inside Apple, even at the very beginning. When Apple's first CEO, Michael Scott, assigned employee numbers, he refused to give Jobs the number 1 slot. He said it would be, quote, too much for Jobs' ego. Scott assigned himself number 7. Jobs was given a lower number and was furious about it. The man who would become the face of Apple couldn't even get first place on his own company's payroll list. Some things never changed, and they're directly connected to why the board voted against him in 1985. Stripped of power but still on the payroll, Jobs did something unexpected. He traveled. First to Paris, then in July of 1985 to Moscow. He was attempting to sell Macintosh computers to the Soviet educational system, reportedly encouraged by U.S. Vice President George Bush, who believed personal technology could spark revolution from below. According to later Pentagon background checks required for top-secret clearance, Jobs noted that his negotiating translator was someone he openly suspected of working for either the CIA or the KGB. Then a television repairman showed up in his hotel room, uninvited, and began dismantling the set. Jobs concluded the room was bugged. Back in Cupertino, Apple was quietly burying something far more expensive. While Jobs wandered abroad, Apple was dealing with another disaster. The Lisa, Apple's earlier machine priced at $10,000, had been a catastrophic commercial failure. An independent reseller named Bob Cook invested over $200,000 of his own money, attempting to refurbish and resell roughly 7,000 unsold units. Apple canceled the deal. Then, in 1989, Apple bulldozed approximately 2,700 brand-new Lisa computers and buried them in a guarded landfill in Logan, Utah, to claim a corporate tax write-off. They literally buried their own engineering history in the ground. And Jobs, sitting in his empty office 4,000 miles away, had no idea any of it was happening. Jobs endured the empty office for 4 months. No staff, no projects, no access to management reports. On September 17, 1985, he resigned. Not fired, he resigned. He wrote a letter to the board, and he had a plan. Build a new computer company that would make Apple obsolete. He called it Next. On his way out the door, he took 5 senior Apple engineers with him. Apple sued him within weeks. The lawsuit was eventually settled. But here is the thing nobody predicted. The company Jobs built in Exile would end up saving the company that exiled him. The press declared Jobs a martyr. Next was going to destroy Apple. In reality, Next, the hardware company, was a quiet disaster. The base machine cost $6,500, which priced it out of its target market of university students almost immediately. Over its entire manufacturing lifespan, Next sold roughly 50,000 total computers. 50,000. Apple was moving more units than that in a bad month. But buried inside that failing hardware was a piece of software that would eventually change everything. And in 1990, one scientist in Switzerland was about to find it. The software inside Next was called NeXTSTEP, an object-oriented operating system that was years ahead of anything else available. In 1990, a British scientist named Tim Berners-Lee sat down at a Next computer at CERN in Switzerland and used NeXTSTEP to build a small project. He called it the World Wide Web. The entire Internet as we use it today was born on a failed hardware platform that Steve Jobs built after getting pushed out of Apple. And that same foundational software architecture would eventually become the core of macOS and iOS. Which is why, in 1996, Apple did something almost nobody saw coming. By 1996, Apple was in genuine crisis. Their own operating system was failing. They evaluated 2 replacement options and chose Next. In December of 1996, Apple paid $429 million to acquire the company Steve Jobs had built after they stripped him of power. They weren't buying a hardware competitor. They had 50,000 units of evidence that Next hardware was irrelevant. They were buying an operating system to save themselves. And packaged with the deal, listed almost as a footnote in the press release, came Steve Jobs. So let's close the loop on every myth. Jobs wasn't fired. He resigned on September 17th after 4 months of voluntary humiliation. The board wasn't blind to his genius. They were terrified his plan to kill the Apple II would bankrupt the company, because it probably would have. The Mac wasn't a triumphant launch. It sold at 27% of target and triggered 1,200 layoffs. The famous garage wasn't a real engineering lab. Wozniak has said so himself. And Next wasn't a hardware success. 50,000 units total. The myth is cleaner than the truth. But the truth is far more interesting. The real lesson isn't about genius being suppressed. It's about what happens when a visionary has no financial discipline, and what that same visionary builds when he's forced to start over with nothing. Jobs at Next was hungrier, more focused, and building something the world didn't know it needed yet. The Exile didn't break him. It produced the operating system that saved Apple, the software Tim Berners-Lee used to invent the internet, and the foundation of every iPhone ever made. If you want more stories where the myth turns out to be wrong in all the best ways, subscribe. We do this every week.